Hey everybody, it's me, it's Shira, and welcome back to Best in Health Radio. A pleasure to have you as always. Okay, we all know I am not shy to bring science that people do not want to hear. And today's show, wow, was I given a hard time when I shared this study. The study was released in July 2016. Alcohol consumption as a cause of cancer. Now, cancer stats tell us that cancer is thought to be only 8 to 10% genetics, and the rest is thought to be lifestyle related. There are definitely mutagenic exposures we are unaware of in our everyday lives. We're always bombarded. However, there are many exposures where we do have choices. All I ever ask is that people make decisions based on science, not on the they says, or they found a random poorly designed study and decided to go with that one. So I am so excited to bring you our guest today, the lead author of this study, Dr. Jennie Connor. Dr. Jennie Connor is chair in Preventive and Social Medicine at the University of Otago Medical School in Dunedin, New Zealand. She is a public health physician and epidemiologist involved in teaching epidemiology and in research about the health effects of alcohol, injury prevention, and sexual health. She has led 2 New Zealand studies on the health burden of alcohol in New Zealand in collaboration with the Global Burden of Disease Alcohol Group and is an advocate for evidence-based alcohol policy. Please welcome Dr. Jennie Connor here to Best in Health Radio. Hello, Dr. Connor.
Hello, and thank you for having me today.
It is such a pleasure, and I have to tell you, this is my very, very favorite study of the hundreds I have read. This is my very favorite study of all time.
Thank you.
So just as blunt as you are in this study, please be with everybody today. Okay, so I'd like to start out with a quote I read on the university website. New Zealanders are living in a kind of fantasy, believes Preventive and Social Medicine professor Jennie Connor. To her mind, we're in a state of denial about just how harmful our national drinking habits really are. Well, it's not just New Zealand. I think it's most countries, most people. I personally cannot stand the expressions of moderation and social drinking. Dr. Connor, your thoughts?
Well, I think that the environment that we live in determines what we consider normal, and so the environment where alcohol is very heavily promoted and promoted as being glamorous, normal, and part of a great life.
And we can't have fun without it.
Sorry?
And we can't have fun without it.
And we can't have fun without it. In that environment, the amount that you can drink and still call it social or moderation is actually quite large. And so people who restrict their drinking, particularly if they're seen to restrict their drinking in a social environment, are not as acceptable as people who will drink to the point that everybody else does.
Yeah. Okay, so before we go any further, I would like you to please discuss how you did the study. You drew from a number of different meta-analyses, and I think that's really important for people to understand that this was just one study, like one really bad study. Someone paid someone off for this study, or whatever people can possibly think. So please explain how you put together this study.
Okay. So the Addiction Journal is the leading scientific alcohol journal, and it commissioned me to write what's essentially a review, I hope an educated review, of the issues that we need to think about when we're thinking about whether alcohol is a cause of cancer. Now, there's nothing absolutely new here. It's just putting the pieces of the puzzle together and trying to explain to people how we come to the conclusion that it's a cause. And I think that the strength of it is that I haven't tried to introduce my own research into here. And the most recent meta-analysis that this paper relies on has more than 500 studies included in it. So there are 500,000 people with cancer who have contributed to the evidence that I've used to base this on. And these are the researchers who have done the groundwork for this. What I've tried to do is put some thinking on top of the evidence, and so that the reader can perhaps understand how we can be so strong in our conclusions.
You know, the reason, as I mentioned to you before, that I really, really wanted you on the show is, first of all, let's be straight. Most people will not read this study. They might pass through a little snippet they read in a newspaper article or online, but they won't actually read the study for various reasons. So I think it's really important, again, as I said in the intro, that people make wise decisions. Jennie, can you please go into the concept of the drinking doesn't hurt me because I don't get drunk? In other words, sobriety is a get out of jail for free card.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's a common misconception that if your drinking doesn't so-called get out of control, that you don't ever get drunk, then it's not going to do you any harm. And this is completely baseless. And the reason that it's not correct is that the effects of alcohol start really from the first drink. And obviously, health risks increase with the amount that you drink, but there is no threshold under which your drinking is completely harmless. There are a number of reasons for it. Intoxication is one of the properties of alcohol that encourages people to drink, and it's also a source of a lot of trouble, a lot of violence, a lot of accidents, a lot of self-harm. But alcohol has other properties that are very important for health, and most of these do not depend on you getting intoxicated in a very obvious way. So alcohol can be addictive if you drink regularly and if you're susceptible. It's carcinogenic, which means it causes cancer. It's poisonous to some organs of your body, particularly your liver, and also to your nervous system. So it's a neurotoxin, and that's the property that it has that damages babies in utero. None of those things, the addictive nature, the fact that it causes cancer, the poisonous effects and the neurotoxic effects, those things don't depend on you getting drunk. So it's certainly true that the risk goes up with the dose, but even at low doses there is a risk.
You mentioned to me before about women with breast cancer, and I don't want to mess this up for you, but how many...
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yes. So in a study that I did in New Zealand of estimating the overall effects of alcohol drinking on all sorts of health problems, when we looked at alcohol-attributable cancer deaths in New Zealand, so just people who die from cancer that wouldn't have occurred if they hadn't been drinkers, we found that about half of all of those cancer deaths were attributable to people who drink 3 drinks a day or less. And so we found this in both men and women, but in women it's mostly breast cancer that contributes to that, because breast cancer turned out to be the leading cause of alcohol-related death in New Zealand women across the board.
And that's the one I read the most studies on. Okay, thank you for saying that, because I think people need to understand that. Okay, so in your conclusion, you say there is strong evidence that alcohol causes cancer at 7 sites in the body and probably others. You go on to say oropharynx, larynx, esophagus, liver, colon, rectum, and female breast. For all these, there is a dose-response relationship where their increase in cancer risk with increased average consumption is monotonic, either linear or exponential, without evidence of threshold of effect. There does not appear to be any variation by beverage type. So a few points here I'd like you to explain. First of all, the dose-response relationship.
Okay, well, this expression comes from health science, I suppose, or environmental science, where the bigger the dose, the bigger the response. So in cancer, there's no doubt that people who drink more have a higher risk. There are all sorts of individual characteristics which will come into play, but if you look at whole populations, which is what I do in epidemiology, the more people drink, the higher their risk. And at a population level, the higher the level of drinking in the population, the more cancer there will be.
Just thought of something here. What about people who say, I don't have a drinking problem, but I do tend to be a binge drinker? So then, there's times where they might go only a drink a day, and then they might tend to go into really heavy drinking for a couple of days. Any research on that off the top of your head?
Well, there's a lot of research into heavy episodic drinking, which is what it's starting to be called. In terms of cancer, if we just focus on cancer, the research evidence tends to suggest that it's your average volume of alcohol over a period of time that contributes to your risk, and so that the binges probably don't make any difference. But there isn't a great deal of specific research on binge drinking. But if you think of how long it takes to develop cancer, it doesn't just happen in a moment.
Great point.
So the accumulated effect of your drinking seems to be related to risk. And the one possible exception to that we know about is pancreatic cancer, because binge drinking damages your pancreas, and it's quite plausible that pancreatic cancer is accelerated by binge drinking.
Wow.
But most of what we're talking about is average consumption.
Right. Okay. Without evidence of threshold effect. Right.
So this is where people start getting concerned and sometimes quite argumentative. We have this notion, we have this tradition, I suppose, of having official drinking guidelines. Now, this is a bit like our legal blood alcohol limit for driving. It's a level that's been officially endorsed as a it's interpreted as a safe level. It's really an officially endorsed guideline to try and get people to moderate their drinking down to that level.
Right.
But what I'm saying is the evidence suggests there is no threshold. So at our official drinking guideline in New Zealand is around about the risk of 1 in 100 chance of dying of your drinking in a lifetime. That's approximately how it's worked out. People think it's very low, but actually a 1% chance of dying of your drinking, I think, is very high, and it's higher than the risk we would accept from a lot of other things.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So as far as we can tell, and I think it's clearest in breast cancer, but as far as we can tell, there isn't any point at which your drinking becomes a risk for cancer. It's always a risk for cancer. It's a line that starts with, essentially with theoretically with the first drink, but we're not as naive to think that one drink is going to do much to your risk.
So that kind of, when it comes to cancer, I'm not going to ask about anything else, but when it comes to cancer, that kind of blows out of the water the concept of moderation.
Yes, so the concept of moderation is interesting.
You're polite.
People want to have a guideline. What is okay for me, and preferably I'd like a guideline that I enjoy. So I'd like to be able to drink, and so I want a guideline that says if you're a moderate drinker, nothing bad is going to happen to you. And luckily for most drinkers, the alcohol industry provides us with that advice every day. The alcohol industry is always telling us, if you drink moderately, you'll be just fine. The evidence doesn't support that. Drinking moderately, which is undefined, or drinking in a low-risk way, is another expression that's used, is better than drinking heavily for your health. But there isn't a point at which it's safe.
You kind of remind me of an expression my father has. My father will say, the food here is poison, and they give such small portions. I can sense a bit of a metaphor there. Okay. Now the next point. This one is probably the number one question I got for you when I asked people to contribute questions. You say appears to be no variation by beverage type. Now, I received every possible modification of that point, so please explain your words there.
Well, the simplest explanation the simplest explanation for the no variation by beverage type is simply that the studies have looked exclusively at the alcohol content. I mean, there have been other research studies that have looked at different types of beverages and which ones confer the most risk or the most benefit and so on. But the conclusions are basically always the same. It's the effect of the alcohol that we're interested in, and if you just look at equivalent amounts of alcohol embedded in different types of beverages, you get the same effects. So the beverages, apart from the alcohol, will have some impact on your health. Certainly if you drink a lot of sugary alcoholic drinks, the sugar will have the same effect as if you were just drinking a sugary drink. But it won't change the alcohol effect. The alcohol effect is the alcohol.
Right. So then what do we answer to people who, there's different alcoholic beverages have different percentages of alcohol? Now, I can't tell you any off the top of my head, but we know beer versus vodka versus wine. How does that come into play here?
Well, for the health effects that I'm describing, particularly the cancer effects, it is the total amount of alcohol that you're consuming that's going to be important on average per week. So when I said that many cancer deaths in New Zealand were attributable to people drinking less than three or less drinks a day, that's about half a bottle of wine. And obviously if you drink wine that has more alcohol in it, you're getting a bigger dose. If you drink wine that has less
tequila
alcohol
or vodka or something which is alcohol.
Yes, but in research situations, the researchers convert all of those different types of drinks to standard drinks, and the standard drinks are just a measure of the amount of alcohol, so the number of grams of alcohol in the drink. And largely we ignore the other effects because from the research that has been done, there's no evidence that whatever else is in your drink is going to interact with the alcohol.
Okay.
So we just work out how many grams of alcohol there are in all of those different beverages, and then we put them all together and estimate how many grams of alcohol you are drinking per day on average.
You say in the study there's 7 sites and probably others. So we talked about female breast, colorectal. They are in our top 5 common cancers. Liver cancer is more common in men. Now, I don't know if I can speak for New Zealand there as well. And alcoholic liver cirrhosis is the major cause of liver disease. Yes, genetics are a factor in these cancers, but as I said in the start, it's thought that genetics is really only about 8 to 10%. The vast majority is lifestyle related. So would you like to give us a little bit more insight, from the study, of course, the 7 sites and probably others?
Yes, so the first thing I'd say is in most countries, alcohol's not the major cause of liver disease, actually, but hepatitis is. And alcohol makes the damage from hepatitis much more of a problem. So they work together to create a lot of damage.
Right.
Genetic factors... So our understanding of the mechanisms by which the cancers arise is always incomplete. I mean, science is always incomplete, and we're always trying to improve our understanding. Genetic factors seem to modify the way in which those pathways work in different individuals. So there will be some individual variation in the way your body handles alcohol due to genetic factors. It doesn't mean that if you have the right genes, you won't be susceptible to these diseases.
I'm so glad you said that. Okay. Wine. I personally believe that people will defend their wine with their lives, maybe literally here even. And I'm just putting it out there that there are many wines around the world that contain many toxic carcinogenic chemicals besides the alcohol. So, for instance, there's a huge stink going on with certain California wines with arsenic. There's a number of wines in Europe, in North America, that have glyphosate. That's the Monsanto Roundup fertilizer chemical, and it's even found in wines made with organic grapes. So, I know what you say in the study. There is skepticism over the old rumor about wine being good for heart health. That being said, please let everybody hear it from you, your thoughts on the glass of wine a day.
Okay. So my thoughts about the glass of wine a day is that people will choose and can choose to drink if they wish. Drinking an average of 1 glass of wine a day is going to increase your risk of a number of conditions, including cancer. But it's the same calculation we make or we don't make when we drive a car, and lots of other things you hear people say glibly, there are worse things than dying of my drinking. People need to know that it's not without a risk. And at 1 glass of wine a day, the risk is modest. But it's not improving your health. And people must be allowed to give up that idea that glass of wine a day is improving their health.
You need to put that in neon lights.
Yeah.
And then
I think the other thing I would say is that the glass of wine a day message has arisen from genuine, well-conducted epidemiological research. It's been relentlessly promoted by industry players and people who want to believe. But as I say, science evolves and is iterative, and the science of taking apart these studies and seeing what's wrong with them is showing quite clearly that there are other explanations for the findings about a glass of wine a day, whereas that's not true for the cancer studies.
Fantastic. And then I have to think, yes, carcinogens are cumulative, just like 1 glass versus 3 glasses versus 5 glasses. And then you put on it the other toxins found in many wines across the globe. The other chemicals in them. I don't know. I think people need to stand up and take a look at that one.
Yeah, so I'm certainly not an expert in things that contaminate wine, but I do know that when you talk about Monsanto Roundup, these are residues that are found in our food as well. And,
sure.
They're a big driver amongst privileged classes of people to go back to eating food that we know the origin of. But nevertheless, these sorts of residues are so widespread that they're in everything. They're in breast milk. So yes. I don't know whether wine has had particular attention because of the controversy over whether we should be drinking it every day, or whether, I don't know what's driving that, but I suspect that these residues are found elsewhere in our food chain.
Absolutely. And again, it's cumulative. Okay, So you were talking just before about liver disease and alcohol and compounding the effects of hepatitis. So that made me think about this point here. For cancers of the mouth, pharynx, larynx, esophagus, there's well-recognized interaction of alcohol with smoking, resulting a multiplicative effect on risk. Biological evidence is supportive of the carcinogenic potential of drinking alcohol and the interaction with smoking, but the mechanisms are not fully understood. NIH, National Institutes of Health, states for oral and pharyngeal cancers, the risks associated with using both alcohol and tobacco are the same thing here. Okay, they are greater than would be expected from adding the individual risks associated with alcohol and tobacco together. Now, we all know that many people combine. I know people who say, I only smoke if I'm drinking alcohol. I mean, we hear it all. Please explain this very important point.
Yeah, so as you'll be well aware, smoking was much more common than it is now. But it's still very strongly linked with drinking, and heavy drinking is particularly associated with being dependent on nicotine as well. And so as far back as when I was a medical student, the only thing I knew about alcohol and cancer was from the head and neck surgeons who would present us with examples of chronic heavy drinkers who also smoke, who had these kinds of cancers, and they had absolutely no doubt that the drinking and the smoking were causal. And so when the International Agency for Research on Cancer started documenting the causal relationships between alcohol and cancer, these were the first ones to be looked at. And they are the cancers that have the strongest relationship with alcohol, but they're not the most common cancers. Now, I'm not an expert on biological mechanisms, but I understand that one of the things that has quite a lot of plausibility is that because alcohol is a solvent, that it somehow facilitates the access of the chemicals from the cigarettes through the mucosa of your mouth. So through to get the chemicals through the lining of those tubes, your mouth and your throat and so on, the alcohol helps with that process, and that's why you get more than the additive effect.
You know, I was reading, again, with NIH, and again, we're talking about the many mechanisms where alcohol affects our health and cancer. But if we want to protect ourselves from this constant bombardment we have from, carcinogens and mutations, et cetera, I was reading something else here. There are several mechanisms by which alcohol impedes immune function. And in one of the many, it does not allow the neutrophils to perform. So when we depend on it also impedes the performance of our digestive system, which is also very important in protecting us from different potential mutagens. Any comments on that in any of the studies you've read? So I was just thinking, this is I know it's multifaceted, the many ways that it affects our health. Okay? But... Yes.
So, yeah. No, so as I say, I have focused more on, because it's my discipline, on the population effects of alcohol, so at a higher level. Rather, I don't think I should probably comment on specific biological things. But we do, we know from our own experience, so if you've ever been a drinker, that you are more vulnerable when you've been drinking than at other times. And that's the same as it takes you into a smoky environment and lots of other risks it puts you in contact with that you wouldn't normally have. It's quite hard to separate out at a population level what's going on in those environments. But there are obviously a number of underlying biological mechanisms by which they work. And we haven't mentioned yet, actually, the main biological mechanism that's thought to account for alcohol being carcinogenic.
The microphone is yours. Go ahead.
The alcohol itself does not seem to be carcinogenic in humans, or only very weakly. But as soon as the alcohol starts being broken down in your body, the first step is to produce something called acetaldehyde. And acetaldehyde definitely is carcinogenic in humans. It causes mutations. And one of the mechanisms that's thought to be important for the head and neck cancers is that acetaldehyde can be produced in the local tissues. It doesn't have to get to your liver in order for that to happen.
Interesting.
And so you get an accumulation of this carcinogenic chemical in the local tissues, and the pathway can't proceed to the next step. The next step is to produce acetate, which is not carcinogenic in the way that acetaldehyde is. So this chemical gets sequestered in the local tissues. But most of the acetaldehyde is produced in the liver, and that's why the liver is a site of a great deal of damage from alcohol.
Okay, Dr. Connor, I promised I would not take any more of your time. Do you have any last thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
I think I have the two small thoughts regarding alcohol and heart disease. If there is a benefit, and some scientists would still argue that there's likely to be a benefit for some members of the population, who have particular drinking patterns. If that's true, there is a better way of reducing your cardiovascular risk. So there are guidelines, there's lifestyle changes, there are medications that are much safer to use than alcohol, and they have prescribed doses, whereas if you say to people, have a glass of wine a day, they'll have 5 or they'll have none. It's not a safe drug to be using as therapy for anything. So I think we don't have to know whether there's a benefit or not. We shouldn't be using alcohol to treat coronary heart disease. That's one point I'd like to make. And the other is to go back to moderation. Regardless of your current level of drinking, if you reduce your current level of drinking, it will reduce your cancer risk.
Fantastic.
And the biggest gains will be for the heaviest drinkers. So if you're a heavy drinker, you're on the steep part of the curve where your risk of cancer is going up quite steeply, and you can bring yourself back down that risk curve by reducing your drinking. But moderation in itself doesn't have a definition, and it's used often to encourage drinking. So I think we think about alcohol and cancer and a few of the other health effects of alcohol. It's not a problem that can be solved by individual decision-making because people can't understand completely the situation. And I think it's a very strong piece of evidence to promote a population approach to alcohol reduction. And we know there are policies we can use to reduce alcohol consumption across the whole population. And those are the ones that are going to reduce alcohol-related cancer substantially.
All right, I know I'm catching you out of left field here. If people would like to look into a little bit more your study, different effects, if they want to they're still a little skeptical, they want to find out a little bit more, where would you refer them to? Any particular sites?
So in terms of alcohol and cancer in particular, Cancer Research UK has a good website with some very
website.
Clear information. Yes, I'm not quite sure beyond that.
Yeah, the National Institute of Health has some incredible research there as well. And I just kind of want to advise people, and I'd love your backup here. For instance, there is this one study that in 2012, Journal of Women's Health, red wine might stave off breast cancer. How do we get people to stay away from such things?
Well, that's the challenge. Getting back to my paper, this was part of the motivation. I get when I make public statements about things, publish research, or speak at conferences, I'm commonly attacked by alcohol industry people. And with regard to this particular paper, when it was featured on our national news program, the reporters feel like they have to give the industry a say. So the Spirits Council sent along one of their people, and he said there's been a lot of research done on alcohol and cancer, and it proves that alcohol doesn't cause cancer. Oh. It's very difficult to, you could draw parallels with politicians, but it's very difficult to dispute something when people are willing to say anything. They're willing to say anything without any evidence that it's true. So it's a study that shows that red wine reduces breast cancer. There is nothing much I can do about that, but try to put out a straight message about what the bulk of the evidence shows.
Right, which is breast cancer is probably the worst of all in terms of the effects of alcohol.
Well, breast tissue seems very sensitive to alcohol, and we don't know. We know something about the mechanisms. I mean, we know that in people who don't have breast cancer, that alcohol affects hormonal regulation.
Right.
And so So alcohol in young women causes breast proliferation. The cells grow, and of course, accelerating the growth of cells is part of the process of producing cancer. So there are lots of theories, but I don't think they're well established yet.
Right. What can I say, Jennie? It was an absolute privilege to have you on the show, and keep up your absolutely fantastic work.
Thank you very much. It was great to talk to you.